That's Nick.
And that's Joseph. And today we're here to talk about Jamel and Tim, the third documentary directed by Michiel Thomas, which premiered at the 2021 Outfest Film Festival. It will be available to stream on various platforms such as Apple TV and Amazon, etc. as of October 18th, 2022.
Do you know Michael's other documentaries?
His first documentary, Game Face, which I think is 2015, focuses on LGBTQ professional athletes, which I have not seen. And his second documentary was called That's Wild, which I also have not seen.
Well, this one was tough to watch because I'm very familiar with the subject matter.
Same.
So it's hard. I think it's well done, but it's weird to say. I mean, it wasn't enjoyable.
No.
But the documentary revolves around
Sexual predator Ed Buck.
Ed Buck, who up until he was convicted of his crimes would often be referred to as this like prominent political donor. He was also dominant. But yeah, and two victims who, two of many who died. Only two died, but he had many victims.
Jamel Moore, who is 26, and Timothy Dean, who is 55, in 2017 and 2019, respectively.
So we get a nice blend of close friends and some family members talking about the victims, combined with some of the people who were integral in sort of bringing attention to this case, and
such as Jasmine Canick.
And Jamel's good friend
Jerome Kitchen.
And then also sort of the political and racial climate that allowed for this to continue. So yeah, it's hard to find proper adjectives. Like, I don't want to say it's interesting, but yeah, it was a tough watch. I was emotional several times watching it.
You know, to think that, so this premiered at a film festival in 2021, so that's right after Ed Buck's convictions, and I think the novelty of having it kind of premiere over a year later, it's following, you know, the Ryan Murphy Dahmer series and the Jeffrey Dahmer tapes, because I think that there are some important conversations that need to kind of link these kind of things and these behaviors. And I do wish the documentary had pushed a little further into kind of more additional underlying issues, such as racial fetishization in the gay community. It's inherent and it's implicit, but I think that there are other conversations that really still need to be had that as a community we haven't really faced.
Well, so Ed Buck is this old white man who lived in West Hollywood in a rent-controlled apartment, and he was known to sort of lure black men to his home for sex with drugs.
Yeah.
And many people described his home as sort of like a drug den. And the two men who died overdosed, and it was found that he was responsible because he provided them with the drugs and also injected them with the drugs.
And in the case of Jamel, who had a journal that explicitly states, this man got me hooked. He's the one who injected me for the first time with crystal meth. And, you know, that's what's so insidious about it, is he would get these men hooked, and then they would keep coming back. You know, it's guaranteed that they would come back for the supply and the money.
So we get, there is a journalist, Jasmine Canick, who was integral in bringing a lot of attention to this situation, because for some time, so it's important to know that West Hollywood as a city is not part of the LAPD. It has its own sheriff's department. And then, of course, a very sort of active city council, the mayor, John Duran, who has a lot of issues because he's been accused of sexual misconduct many times, but he was friends with Ed Buck. So, you know, maybe some corruption and some, you know, favors that were had, or maybe a blind eye was turned because of Ed Buck's political donations, which, again, prior to him being convicted, it's very interesting to see how the media painted this person, Ed Buck, as like this prominent political donor, and all the pictures that were shown of him were like when he was younger, and pictures of him with prominent political figures like Hillary Clinton. But in reality, that man was old and trollish, and anyone who saw him like in like how he looked today would think that he's just like a creep. So it's funny how Not that his appearance should get him in trouble, but it's just funny how it's spinned.
Well, like how kind of decrepit he's become, because he is an addict as well, based as compared to these older pictures of him, and the continual reference to him as a mega donor. But for anybody who lives in LA or has lived in West Hollywood, it's like once you know where he lives, it's like, wait a minute, he can't.
And he has given quite a bit.
Yes, he has.
But he's he's not a multi-millionaire as far as we can tell. The documentary doesn't have access to his finances. The only thing we know is that he sold a business in 1980 for $1 million. Mm-hmm. So presumably invested that, whatnot.
And was a Republican initially.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we also hear, we should probably talk about the victims too, or first. Mm-hmm. So Jamel was part of the ballroom scene. He was quite young. Mm-hmm. He left his home in Florida at 17 to come to West Hollywood and sort of like live his true self. And then Tim was an athlete who was very much into fashion. Mm-hmm. He actually played in like the gay games, basketball.
Went to Paris in 2018. Mm-hmm.
Of course, they were both loved by their friends and families, so we get a lot of that, which is probably what got me the most emotional. Mm-hmm. But I think what the documentary does well is that it doesn't shy away from the darker bits, and the reality of the situation, which is that these men became addicts. Mm-hmm. One of whom, Jamel, who he writes in his journal, became an addict because of Ed Buck. And Tim had struggled with addiction, and then, dealing with Ed Buck would sort of relapse often because of money issues. I don't know. I just felt it was really troubling. And like you already alluded to, I feel like where the documentary sort of lacks a little bit is not exploring the fetishization, but also there's a lot of emphasis placed on Jackie Lacey, who used to be the district attorney of LA, but no, she was voted out. But it's very easy to make her a villain because she kind of is with involving other things.
Yeah.
But I think what the documentary shies away from is it does mention, because we get footage of her explaining the reason charges weren't brought against Ed Buck initially is because they just didn't have the evidence. And the evidence they did have was collected in a way that was illegal.
Mm-hmm. But by the time she explained that, years had passed, and it's like,
right.
You could have been more. Jackie Lacey, how she dealt with a lot of things was she just stuck her head in the sand, I think is how it felt a lot.
Sure. So, I wish that we would have sort of stated the facts of why this case kind of dragged out longer than it should have because of the poor management of law enforcement. But then also talk about how, yes, he's a predator, but specifically and we do get a little bit from one of the gentlemen talking about how he was preying on black men because he knew they were more vulnerable. But I think we needed more.
I think it goes beyond that, though.
Yeah, yeah. So we do get, I only know her by her stage name, which is Gia Tishi, who was featured on the HBO show Legendary because Jamel was part of the ballroom scene. So we get Gia talking about him, and she's such a lovely lady, and I was emotional listening to her speak. And then, like you mentioned, Jamel kept a journal, so we get 3 of his friends reading excerpts from his journal.
Yeah, it's hard to.
And that was really hard to listen to. Something that really it also troubled me a lot was one of Tim's friends, because after Jamel died, Tim was still interacting with Ed Buck because he needed money and he was a drug addict. And his friends would sort of warn him, but they all knew that he was doing it. And of course, Tim felt like he could take care of himself. And Tim was the older gentleman. And also a very big, strong man. And Ed Buck is like this, decrepit old little thing. Mm-hmm. But when the news broke out about the second man who died at Ed Buck's apartment, there were visuals of a body wrapped in a sheet outside of his front door. And one of Tim's friends texted him the picture. Like, oh my gosh, look what happened again. Not knowing that
it's him.
The picture he sent his friend was of his body. That's wild as hell.
It's wild. But, and I think that there could have been, better parallels drawn with more universal themes too about the compartmentalization of gay men and how we live our lives and how we dole out or we reveal only certain parts of ourselves. Because a lot of Tim's friends in particular were saying, I can't believe he never mentioned that he had the struggle with this or wouldn't talk about that. It's like, yeah, but because you would have no idea how to talk to him about it.
They do they do explicitly say like he did like to compartmentalize, but yeah, I think a greater conversation could have been had. We do get two people who provided testimony to the DA's office initially, but of course they weren't taken seriously, who talk about their experiences with Ed Buck, including a gentleman who was given a shot of Viagra, like directly into his penis.
Yeah, that was...
and then suffered priapism, like, the next day and had to have, like... He describes how it was treated, which sounds just so...
It sounds so terrible.
Horrible.
Like, he had to have surgery and the blood had dried in his penis, and he talks about... I mean, he gives very vague details, but about having to scrape that away, and it's just like, this man is injecting... He injected this man, and then...
Part of his fetish was to want to provide the injection.
Because the drugs, make you flaccid that you're taking, so...
I just think, like... I don't know. I feel like this was a nice celebration of the lives of the two people who were killed by Ed Buck. But also being realistic about, they were not only victims of this predator, but victims of their own vices. I also felt like, thank goodness for these friends who, especially Jerome, like he was just really out there screaming at the top of his lungs.
The tenacity to...
Like, I know something's wrong, and this man is just sitting here in this apartment and organizing little rallies in front. I mean, it's unfortunate he had to do that, but then he does talk about how that sort of inspired him to, like motivate him to do something. And so I think that was special. And other friends, including Tim's friends, talk about the importance of trying to make him seem like, both of them seem like a whole person, as they say, and not just how the media was describing them as like sex worker, drug addict, porn star. Like, these were real people who had lives and friends, and so good job in that regard.
Well, if there's any indication of the world having changed at all, it's that there's an interest and availability of something coming together like this, as opposed to all of these gay black men murdered by Jeffrey Dahmer, who kind of remain faceless and nameless, even despite this high-profile documentary or fictionalized series from Ryan Murphy, which kind of highlights here and there. There's a mechanism, an animated mechanism that's employed throughout. This.
Yes, I did think that was well done.
It reminded me. I wrote down this is the sunken place that he was putting them in. Like, if there's
hearing the description of his apartment is just like, ugh, like, yeah. It I could go on, but I don't want to because it's just depressing. But I think, one of the friends you already mentioned, but one of the friends talks about not knowing this part of his friend's life, and I think. Yeah, we need to talk, like, be more open, or like we need to ask when we think something's wrong, like talk to people in a way that makes them. I don't know the answer.
There isn't, and then there's a lack of resources for everybody. But talking about how getting the therapy and the help you need, it's not that easy.
It's not that
even
easy.
when you have insurance.
It's not that easy, and I'm sure it's not. The reason I stumble is because it's one thing to say like talk to me if you have problems, but. It's not that easy. And also, like, and then what can I offer? Like, what can I do? I'm sure people feel like, I don't want to talk to you about it because you can't do shit. And, like, addiction is real. Like, it takes more than someone telling you stop. So,
yes, for sure.
So, yeah, it's just really sad. And, yeah.
And Ed Buck is not an anomaly. And there
are a lot of Ed Bucks out there luring
right now, and there are many people not featured in this documentary that came in contact with him, and I'm sure others like him. I mean, the way that his apartment is described, there are countless numbers of those kind of dens throughout this city and
every
others.
Major city. Ed Buck did receive 30 years in prison. So hopefully he won't be doing this to anyone else. I'm assuming he won't live.
But that's what's wild. It's like, even with all of the cameras they're even when they're dragging, I think, is it Jamel's body out of there? There's another
black guy like trying to get up to his place.
Like, it's unreal, and it's just so clear. But he, not to make excuses for him, but he's an addict too. It's like he can't help himself. So it's like,
No,
talk about a danger to society, though.
Yeah. What would you give this documentary?
I think 3.5. I think it's meaningful and important, and I think it was important to speak on it because I don't, this doesn't have the the national appeal of Dahmer, but it's also all part of the same conversation that we need to be.
I was going to apologize for not speaking eloquently in this review, but I don't really ever. But yeah, I would give it 3.5 out of 5. I thought it was very good. I think I stumbled a lot just because it's frustrating.
It's emotional. It's frustrating.
And I don't know what purpose, like in the big scheme of things, what telling these stories is important.
Yeah.
But it's just frustrating. Like it's still happening, especially like you said after watching Dahmer. It's like, okay, so 20, 30 years later.
It's awareness. How are we going to change our behavior? Each and every one of us, can play a part in having an awareness and being able to speak to people and talk to people, looking out for one another, as I've said before. Like, everybody plays a part in this.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
No.
Hit the thanks button. Listen to our podcast. Bye.